President Trump has long been fixated on Iran, but recently he's turned things up a notch.
We're going to be sending a relatively small number of troops. We have one of the most powerful ships in the world that's loaded up, and we don't want to have to do anything. It's going to be a bad problem for Iran if something happens, I can tell you that.
Trump and the president of Iran have been engaged in a war of words, leading to some pretty dramatic headlines.
Tonight, a major escalation between the U.S. and Iran.
The drumbeat of war is growing louder from the White House.
But to understand how we got here and why things have gotten so tense so quickly, we have to rewind to the 1950s. In 1953, British and American intelligence agents orchestrated a plot to oust Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and restore the autocratic king, the Shah, to power.
Pro-royalist mobs roamed the streets battling Mossadegh's forces to a standstill.
Mossadegh had nationalized the country's oil industry, which had previously been controlled by the British for almost 50 years. The young Shah, on the other hand, was much more willing to bend to Western interests.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob, had no ideology, and that mob was paid for by American dollars.
And it was the United States only a few years later that helped Iran set up its first nuclear technology. Fast forward to 1979, when protests led by nationalists and leftists, and later co-opted by the religious right, filled the streets of Tehran. After months of demonstrations, the US-backed Shah fled the country, and religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini declared Iran an Islamic republic, pushing out nationalists and left-wing allies in favor of anti-American conservative social values. In November that same year, a group of students stormed and occupied the US Embassy in Tehran, taking more than 50 Americans hostage for over a year. The United States cut ties and then went on to back Iraq after it invaded Iran, which led to a bloody 8-year war that involved chemical weapons and left nearly 1 million people dead.
It was the bloodiest confrontation in the history of the Middle East.
Both the revolution and the hostage crisis are seen as a direct response to American interference in Iranian affairs and would go on to set the tone for relations between the two countries for decades.
This picture tells it all.
Then in 1983, President Ronald Reagan labeled Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism after a suicide bomber targeted a U.S. military base in Beirut, killing 241 American troops.
The truck was packed with more than 500 pounds of TNT.
3 years later, while Iran and Iraq were still at war, the Reagan administration was caught selling weapons to Iran and using the money to fund rebels in Nicaragua, violating both the government's own policy of not negotiating with terrorists and a series of laws designed to prevent American support of the Contras.
This was a mistake.
Then you have Iran Air Flight 655. In 1988, towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War, a U.S. naval ship mistakenly shot down an Iranian passenger plane, killing all 290 people on board. The U.S. has always said it was an accident, but many Iranians don't believe that. Things started to get better in the late 90s, but it didn't last.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it further complicated the power struggle between Iran and its regional rival, Saudi Arabia. Then in 2005, Iran elected a new controversial leader. During his time in office, tensions over Iran's nuclear program hit an all-time high. The international community feared that Tehran was working towards developing a nuclear weapon, so they imposed harsh sanctions that crippled Iran's economy. Despite that, Iran has continued to be locked in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia, backing various militias across the Middle East. Fast forward to 2013, when moderate Hassan Rouhani came to power on the promise that he'd revive the country's weakened economy. To do that, he needed sanctions lifted, so right after his election, he resumed negotiations with the US and other world powers on Iran's nuclear program. Obama even called Rouhani the highest level of contact between the two countries since 1979. That set the groundwork for the Iran nuclear deal, signed in 2015 between Iran and the US and 5 other world powers.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
It was a historic moment, but then 2016 happened.
The United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Since Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, things have taken a turn for the worst. And Trump is surrounded by advisors who are staunchly anti-Iran. But even though both leaders have ramped up their military posturing, most experts agree that a conflict is unlikely. Of course, it's hard to say what both leaders will do next. But if history is any indication, neither Iran or the United States want yet another war in the Middle East.